Dad blamed me for his failed marriage before I was even born and refused to walk me down the aisle, choosing to be with his real daughter instead. My parents had my sister, Natalie, when they were still quite young, which meant she essentially grew up alongside them. In a way, the three of them formed a small, tight-knit team for years. Since both my mom and dad were highly career-driven, they passed that same ambition down to Natalie early on. Their shared focus on success kept them constantly striving for more, pushing forward in their careers and making the most of every opportunity. But with such a singular drive came its own set of challenges, and things weren't always as smooth as they might have appeared from the outside. Before I even entered the picture, tensions had already started building between my parents. Both were so consumed by work that their relationship began to suffer. At some point, my dad, perhaps overwhelmed by his own insecurities, started suspecting my mom of having an affair. In hindsight, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that they had stopped prioritizing each other. There were no more date nights, no real quality time together. And instead of talking things out, my dad let doubt creep in. The irony was that my mom wasn't seeing anyone else. She was just drowning in responsibilities, trying to juggle her demanding job, taking care of Natalie, and managing everything at home. That level of exhaustion must have been overwhelming for her. Given all the pressure she was under, it's no surprise that their marriage started to crack. Then one day, my mom suddenly collapsed at work. At first, everyone assumed it was stress. Nothing out of the ordinary for someone working herself to the bone. But when she was rushed to the hospital, the doctors uncovered something completely unexpected. She was 3 months pregnant with me. And the craziest part? She had no idea. Between her relentless workload, raising Natalie, and handling everything else, she had somehow missed all the signs. But if that was shocking, my dad's reaction to the news was even worse. Instead of excitement or even surprise, his first instinct was disbelief. The bad kind. He outright refused to believe that the baby was his. The accusation hit my mom hard. She was being blamed for something she hadn't done. And no matter how much she defended herself, insisting she had always been faithful, my dad refused to listen. He was too consumed by his own paranoia. Natalie, who was old enough at the time to understand what was happening, later told me that my dad stormed out that very night. He told my mom he wasn't coming back until she could prove, beyond a doubt, that I was his child. When the DNA test results came in, confirming that I was in fact his, my dad was left speechless. My grandparents, however, were far from quiet about it. They tore into him for how horribly he had treated my mom, how he had doubted her, abandoned her, and put her through all that stress while she was pregnant. They stood firmly by my mom's side, calling out my dad for his complete lack of trust and his failure as a husband. After being confronted by his own parents and realizing just how deeply he had hurt my mom, my dad had no choice but to swallow his pride and beg for forgiveness. Eventually, he moved back in, supposedly for the sake of our family. But even though they reconciled, something between my parents had fundamentally shifted. From that moment on, my mom made it clear things were going to change. For years, she had carried more than her fair share of responsibilities, both at work and at home. But after everything she had been through, she wasn't willing to shoulder that burden alone anymore. She told my dad, in no uncertain terms, that if he wanted to be part of this family, he had to step up. No more coasting, no more leaving everything to her. And she wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just a warning. It was a complete restructuring of their marriage. My dad had no choice but to accept it. While they stayed together, the trust between them had been damaged beyond repair. And for some reason, my dad always seemed to blame me for that. In his mind, it was as if my very existence had triggered the breakdown of their marriage, like I was responsible for his suspicions, for the way their relationship changed afterward. It's ridiculous, I know, childish even, but that's how my dad operates. Since the day I was born, he has held this bizarre grudge against me, treating me as though I'm some kind of stain on his life. The strangest part is how two-faced he is about it in front of other people. He plays the role of a caring father, kind, pleasant, even affectionate when there's an audience, but the moment we're alone or even just around my mom or Natalie, his entire demeanor shifts. He goes ice cold, like I don't even exist. It's like watching someone flip a switch. I've felt his resentment since I was a kid. Even Natalie remembers how distant and neglectful he was when I was born. She's told me stories about how, when I cried as a baby, my dad would just ignore me, making no effort to comfort or hold me. Whenever I was upset or crying as a child, my dad never once stepped in to comfort me. He left all of that to my mom, Natalie, or the babysitter. Basically anyone but him. It was as if from the very beginning he had decided I wasn't his responsibility, that I was just some unnecessary addition to their lives. That feeling of being unwanted, of being an inconvenience, has followed me for as long as I can remember. The only time he ever acknowledged me was when I achieved something noteworthy, especially in school. In high school, I became obsessed with people-pleasing, desperate for his approval in the only way I knew how, through my accomplishments. I pushed myself relentlessly to get top grades because I knew that was the only thing that would make him pay attention to me. His recognition wasn't freely given. It had a price. I had to earn it. If I wasn't excelling, I was invisible to him. It was never about love or connection. It was transactional, and for years I kept chasing that approval, hoping that maybe if I did well enough he'd finally see me. But deep down I always knew the truth. No matter how hard I worked, I would never change the way he saw me. As I grew older and went off to college, reality hit me even harder. No matter how many good grades I brought home, no matter how hard I tried, I would always come second to Natalie in my dad's eyes. It didn't matter how much effort I put into impressing him. Natalie was always his favorite, and I would never measure up. Despite that, I have never once resented my sister for it. Natalie and I have always had a great relationship, and I am endlessly grateful for her. Because of the big age gap between us, she's always been more than just a sister. She's felt almost like a second mom to me, loving, protective, and always making sure I felt included. Natalie has done everything she could to make up for what I lacked from our father, and even though I don't blame her for his behavior, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. A little jealous. She has something with him that I will never have, a genuine bond, a closeness I've only ever been able to watch from the outside. I've longed for that connection my entire life, but no matter how much my mom pushed my dad to be more involved with me, he never did. He always made it clear that I wasn't a part of that world, that I didn't belong in that inner circle. My mom tried, God, she tried, but his heart was never in it, and that hurt more than I can even put into words. After I graduated from college, I had a moment of reckoning. I realized I had spent my entire life running after my father's attention, desperately seeking approval that would never come. It was exhausting, draining, to constantly feel like I wasn't enough, like I was reaching for something that would always be just out of grasp. So I stopped chasing after him. I stopped trying to make him see me. Instead, I turned inward. I started therapy, where I finally confronted all the pain and frustration I had carried for years. Therapy helped me work through the feelings of abandonment and exclusion, and for the first time in my life, I began to heal. I started putting my energy into what truly mattered: my personal growth, my career, my own happiness. For years, I poured myself into my work. It wasn't easy, and it took time, but eventually, I reached a place where I no longer craved my father's validation. I found peace in accepting that I would never have the relationship I once wished for. Then, 3 years ago, John walked into my life and everything changed for the better. He's tall, charming, and from the moment we met, we just clicked. It didn't take long for us to fall in love, and being with him has made me stronger, more confident, and happier than I ever thought possible. John has been my rock, always supporting me, always encouraging me to grow. The thing I love most about him is that he knows everything about my family history, all the ups and downs, the complicated relationship I have with my dad, and he never judges me for it. In fact, he strongly dislikes my dad, and honestly, I can't blame him. Whenever John has had to interact with my dad at family gatherings or events, he barely acknowledges him. It's almost poetic. The same way my dad has ignored me my entire life, John ignores him. It's his quiet way of standing up for me. And when they do exchange words, John keeps it polite but brief, short, surface-level answers, never giving my dad more than he has to. My dad has never said a word to me about John's behavior. Maybe he doesn't want to admit that John is simply treating him the way he's always treated me. A few months ago, John proposed, and of course I said yes. Since then, we've been in full wedding planning mode, excited to start this next chapter together. Both John and I have solid careers, and we've always been on the same page about staying child-free, which has given us the financial freedom to plan the wedding of our dreams without worrying about future expenses. We've set aside enough to make this day a huge celebration, inviting all our loved ones, even those who live far away, to join us. This wedding isn't just about us getting married. It's about celebrating everything we've built together, everything we've overcome. It's about stepping into the rest of our lives surrounded by the people who truly matter. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. During the wedding planning, my mom kept insisting that I should ask my dad to walk me down the aisle. It was something I had briefly considered but never felt truly comfortable with. Given our complicated relationship, I just didn't want him in that role on such an important day. It didn't feel right. The idea of him walking me down the aisle didn't hold the sentimental value it might have for others. Instead, I wanted my uncle, my mom's brother, to do it. My uncle has always been one of my favorite people in the world. Right after my mom and Natalie, he's been such a fun, supportive presence in my life, always making me feel valued in ways my dad never did. The thought of having him by my side as I stepped into this new chapter just felt right. It made sense. But when I told my mom that I wanted my uncle to walk me down the aisle, she didn't take it well. She immediately launched into a rant about how it would be insensitive to choose my uncle when my dad was still alive. She was worried about how it would look to the rest of the family, saying that people would find it strange, even disrespectful, if I didn't follow tradition. I understood where she was coming from, at least to some extent. The father walking the bride down the aisle is a long-standing tradition, and from the outside it might seem odd to go against it, but for me this wasn't about tradition or keeping up appearances. It was about choosing someone who had actually been there for me, someone I had a real connection with. I felt torn, stuck between doing what my mom and probably a lot of the extended family expected and staying true to what I wanted. But my mom wouldn't let it go. She kept insisting, pushing, until eventually I gave in. I agreed to ask my dad. Even though it wasn't what I truly wanted, I figured if it meant that much to her, maybe I could endure it, and honestly, I just wanted to avoid any unnecessary drama leading up to the wedding. But when I finally worked up the nerve to ask my dad, his reaction was far worse than anything I had anticipated. Instead of being touched or even considering it, he acted like I had just asked him for something ridiculous. Like it was offensive for me to even bring it up. He straight up told me that he had never even thought about walking me down the aisle because, in his own words, he didn't really see me as his real daughter. Hearing those words hurt, but it wasn't shocking. I had heard similar things from him before. Over the years, I've grown almost numb to his coldness. I just sighed, trying to push forward with the conversation. I explained how much it would mean to Mom, hoping that framing it that way, making it about her rather than us, might get through to him. Maybe if he saw it as something for family harmony, he'd at least consider it. But he just shrugged, completely indifferent. Then, he went on to say that the only daughter he ever wanted to walk down the aisle was Natalie. For context, Natalie has made it very clear to everyone that she never plans to get married. She's firmly against the idea, which has apparently been a long-time frustration for my parents. But that's a whole other story. Regardless of her personal choice, the fact that my dad could so bluntly state that he only saw Natalie as his daughter when it came to something as symbolic as walking down the aisle cut deep. To make it worse, he casually suggested that I didn't really need anyone to walk me down the aisle anyway, brushing off the whole thing as nonsense tradition. It was just another way of dismissing me entirely, like he always had. At that point, I saw no reason to argue. There was nothing left to say. I left the conversation feeling defeated, but not surprised. It was just another reminder of the emotional distance that had always been there. After taking some time to think, I decided to follow my heart. I asked my uncle to walk me down the aisle instead. When I approached him with the request, he was absolutely thrilled. He said yes immediately, clearly honored and excited to be a part of such an important moment in my life. His genuine happiness reassured me. I knew I had made the right choice. I also spoke to Natalie and my mom about what had happened. They were both disappointed in my dad, though not exactly surprised. Natalie, especially, was frustrated. She's always been more aware than anyone of how unfairly our dad has treated me over the years. Both of them agreed that if my dad didn't want to be there for me in that way, then choosing my uncle was the best decision. Their support meant everything to me and made the whole situation easier to accept. On the day of the wedding, my uncle proudly walked me down the aisle, and it was perfect. The ceremony was beautiful, and I couldn't have asked for a better person to be by my side. The love and joy in that moment were overwhelming. And when John and I read our vows, there wasn't a single dry eye in the room. Everyone could feel how much we meant to each other. And for that brief time, everything felt absolutely right. As for my dad, he showed up, but true to form, he barely interacted with John or me. He didn't congratulate us during family photos. He kept his distance, almost like we weren't even there. I refused to let it ruin my day, though. I focused on the people who truly cared about me, the ones who were genuinely happy to celebrate with us. However, it seems that other guests took notice of my dad's behavior. After the wedding, word started getting around about how he had refused to walk me down the aisle. I don't know if it was Natalie, my mom, or my uncle who told people, but whoever it was, they made sure the truth was known. Since then, my dad has been getting an earful from various family members and guests. Apparently, they've been openly calling him out for being a deadbeat father, some even sarcastically congratulating him on being such a great dad. It's ironic. After all these years of ignoring me, of acting like I didn't exist. He's finally being forced to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. And honestly, I don't feel bad for him one bit. I first heard about all of this from my mom when she called me, laughing about what my dad was going through. Apparently, he was finally facing some real consequences from our family for his behavior. And honestly, I found it interesting to see him being held accountable for once. I figured the backlash would eventually die down. But last week, he started leaving me voicemails, asking me to clarify things. He wanted me to tell everyone that he had always been there for me, the best he could, because he had been receiving a lot of hate. More specifically, he wanted me to start telling people that it was actually me who didn't ask him to walk me down the aisle. Obviously, I refused. That was a complete lie, and I wasn't about to help him rewrite history just to save face. After a few attempts to convince me, he seemed to give up. I assumed he had accepted the situation and moved on. But then today, he reached out again, this time, demanding that I clear his name. He claimed that the fallout with our family was now starting to affect his relationships. And if this continued, it could even impact Natalie's future wedding. That part made my blood boil. He told me that with the way things were going, if Natalie ever decided to get married, she might not even ask him to walk her down the aisle. And apparently my tantrum over not clarifying things was ruining everything for him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad hadn't once apologized for the way he treated me. He hadn't even acknowledged that what he did was wrong. The only thing he cared about was himself. And of course, his precious relationship with Natalie. He was worried about some hypothetical future wedding that may never even happen. But he couldn't spare a single thought about how his actions had affected me for years. I made myself very clear. I told him I wasn't going to give him what he wanted. I reminded him that, since he had never truly seen me as his daughter, something he had made painfully obvious over the years, he had no right to make demands or even contact me about this again. I wasn't going to clear his name. He made this mess, and he could deal with it himself. Since then, he has been bombarding me with messages, trying to guilt-trip me. He keeps whining about how unfair it is that everyone in the family now sees him in a negative light, acting like I'm the one making his life difficult for no reason. He's playing the victim, completely ignoring the years of emotional neglect and pain he put me through. It's frustrating. Update 1. Thank you to everyone for your kind words. As many of you have rightly pointed out, for my dad, it has never been about me. It has always been about appearances. He doesn't care that he hurt me. He only cares that his reputation is now taking a hit. Honestly, this situation has only solidified my decision to cut him out of my life completely. For those wondering why I didn't do this sooner, it's because he was never really an important part of my life. I had long since learned to live without him. It was only because my mom wanted me to ask him to walk me down the aisle that all of these old wounds reopened. A part of me thought maybe it could be a chance for reconciliation. Clearly, that was a mistake. Update 2. My husband had a talk with my dad today and told him to back off. Daniel made it very clear that he fully agreed with the rest of the family calling my dad a deadbeat. Because that's exactly what he is. He told my dad that he has been a useless figure in my life, never contributing anything meaningful. Daniel also pointed out that, despite my dad's resentment toward me, I had still managed to build a successful life for myself. And now that I was married, he wasn't going to allow anyone, including my father, to treat me this way. Daniel then gave him an ultimatum. If he had any further issues with me, he should go through him instead of bothering me. Since that conversation, my dad has been too scared to send me another text. Update 3. A lot of people have asked why my mom and Natalie didn't step in sooner, or why they seem to let my dad get away with treating me like this. I want to clarify that they have always taken my side, but while they never just stood by and let it happen, they also couldn't completely control him. Now on to the actual update. I had a deep conversation with my mom about everything. I finally told her exactly how I felt all these years. I explained how painful it was growing up with a father who resented me so much, and how, even though I had tried to brush it off for most of my life, I was done pretending it didn't hurt. Now that I was an adult and married, I was sick of him still treating me like garbage. I told her that my dad had blamed me for something completely out of my control since the day I was born, and that, in reality, I had spent my entire life without a father figure. Hearing this, my mom teared up. She apologized for not protecting me more and admitted that she should have stood up for me better. Then, I brought up the fact that while my dad had stopped texting me for now, there was no guarantee he wouldn't start up again. I told her that she needed to speak to him and make it very clear that he had to leave me alone because his words were starting to take a real toll on my mental health. She pulled me into a hug and promised that she would handle it immediately. Even my paternal grandparents ended up staging an intervention for my dad. From what I've gathered, they, along with my mom, Natalie, and my uncle, all confronted him about the way he had mistreated me for no valid reason. They made it crystal clear that he had no one to blame but himself. Not me, not my mom, just him, for being foolish enough to doubt his loyal wife all those years ago. I don't know the exact details of what was said during that intervention, but it must have been brutal because my dad's attitude completely shifted afterward. Following that, he reached out to me again, this time with what I can only describe as a half-hearted apology. I have no doubt he was pressured into it. He acknowledged that he had been in the wrong, but he didn't exactly take full accountability. Instead, he admitted that while he still couldn't help but dislike me, he would at least keep those feelings to himself moving forward and stop bothering me about it. He also apologized for refusing to walk me down the aisle and promised that he would never again ask me to clear his name with the rest of the family. I took that opportunity to set a firm boundary with him once and for all. I told him that, for the sake of my own mental peace, I was cutting him off completely. I had no interest in maintaining any kind of relationship with someone who had hurt me so deeply and repeatedly. To my surprise, he accepted my decision without much pushback. Date 4. It's been 7 months since I cut my dad out of my life. While I still see my family, I make sure to avoid any events where he'll be present. And thankfully, he does the same. Interestingly enough, about 4 months ago, Natalie cut him off too. She moved to a new city, then blocked him on everything. She later told me that she had been carrying a deep sense of guilt over the way our dad had always treated her better than me. She had already been considering cutting ties with him for a while, and the move finally gave her the fresh start she needed to break free. My mom mentioned that my dad was devastated when he found out that Natalie wanted nothing to do with him anymore. But at this point, there's nothing he can do about it. I have to say, these days I feel lighter, happier than I have in years. For so long, I had carried the burden of trying to earn my dad's approval, of trying to understand why I was never good enough in his eyes. But letting go of that, severing ties with him completely, has been the healthiest decision I've ever made. If anything, I wish I had done it sooner. Right now, my focus is fully on my life, my marriage, and the people who actually love and support me, and honestly, I've never been better.